Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm really delighted to be joined by 3 experts, all of whom come together under a single banner at FG, but have different levels of expertise and different experiences. So it'll be really good for them to share some experience and case studies for us all, and then we'll have a panel session at the end whereby I can field all your questions to them. So please do pop any questions into the chat function. There's a chat box up here, so just drop your questions in and then I can field those. So we're going to start with Mark Gilkes, who's Fisher German's DCO expert, and then we're going to move on to Sarah Renzy Thomson, who heads up the planning team at Fisher German, and then we're going to finish with Tom Beeley, who's Fisher German's natural capital expert, who's going to talk very specifically about biodiversity net gain today, and then we'll do a panel session. Now these 3 people work together on a variety of different projects, so there'll be questions that we can put to all of them. Hopefully everyone can see the screen, and I'm going to hand over to Mark first.
Thanks, Rachel. Oh, lots of binging going on every time people join. But hi, so I'm Mark Gilkes, one of the partners at Fisher German. Down there as a DCO lead, and certainly one of many DCO leads, I guess, at Fisher German, but I have the pleasure of leading up our major project forum group. So that's trying to make sure across all the different major projects and DCOs and CPOs we work on across Fisher German, that we're working as systematically and kind of in similar ways and sharing lessons learned across all those different projects. So yeah, that's me. Been at Fisher German since 2008. Next slide, please. So yeah, I was going to just do a little 10-15 minutes today on development consent orders. I'll start off with what they are, some information about them, and we'll go on to some kind of updates in the field and a quick case study. But from a kind of a high level, a development consent order is the kind of consenting regime for nationally significant infrastructure projects. Depending on where you are in the UK, most things make sense in England. It's pretty straightforward here in that the Planning Act defines those projects which are nationally significant infrastructure projects. I'm guessing the audience today are going to be most interested in pipelines, and I've put some bullet points there of what means that this a new gas pipeline scheme might be or considered a nationally significant infrastructure project, and if it is, essentially it's a different consenting regime to get permission to build the scheme as it used to be. So previously we would seek planning permission, and each type of infrastructure would have its own kind of legislation. So a gas pipeline would be governed by the Gas Act, or water pipeline would be governed by the Water Industry Act. Now for schemes which meet the criteria of being a national significant infrastructure project, are all consented in via a development consent order, which gives you your planning and your land rights all in one piece of legislation that you apply for. You apply to the planning inspectorate for them to review your application, and then they give a recommendation, and the Secretary of State for the relevant thing that you're developing, they'll decide whether to grant that consent or not. I guess the main difference between, and the reason that the Planning Act, which governs all this, was brought in, was to enable projects which aren't always that popular in their local area to achieve consent, because the local authorities become consultees, not the decision makers for giving that planning permission. So kind of essentially decision making was delegated to a kind of a government level. I've put a couple of bullet points there. If you're in Scotland or Wales, it gets a little bit complicated. Scotland, well, it doesn't get complicated there. The DCO regime doesn't exist. So that's kind of under what I would call the old system. So that's still planning and CPO under the relevant rights. Wales has a similar regime, but different NSIP thresholds. And if it's cross-border, often it can be a DCO. And the other thing to probably bear in mind about DCOs is, even if your project doesn't qualify as a nationally significant infrastructure project, but it's close or borderline, you can actually apply to have it judged as a DCO by PINs, and a number of projects do that because one of the benefits of a DCO project is you have more defined timelines because the examination is a fixed process. Want to go on a slide, thanks. So the process itself, this makes it sound quite easy, but there's a kind of pre-application process, which is where you design your schemes, your corridors, you try and figure out what you're trying to achieve, and you start kind of routing and identifying your kind of high level constraints, and we're going to go, if we're building a pipeline, you're going to go this way around the town, we're going to go that way, high level things, and you start to identify landowners and land uses and start that kind of high level engagement. But most importantly, from a kind of project delivery point of view, this is when we're setting up our kind of project teams to do all that work and start in kind of engaging with each other to figure out what the scheme is, how best to deliver it, and start that kind of early engagement. And up until recently, you were kind of always building towards what was called a statutory consultation, which is where you take a kind of your final best solution to a scheme to the public and to statutory consultees, and in a kind of formal way you have consultation events and bring people and ask people for their views and comments on that scheme, and you seek feedback, and then you try and take that feedback and redesign or kind of check your scheme's fit for purpose. That process has now been kind of, or subject to change, and have been some ongoing changes to that are in consultation, which we'll come on to in a minute. But ultimately, whether you call it statutory consultation or consultation, I think ultimately all schemes will still want to consult on a fairly defined scheme at some point, just to make sure that they've got that engagement with the community, particularly from a lands perspective, with people that are identifying the landowners and negotiating for those rights with landowners, taking them on that journey with you and making sure they're engaged along the way and they've had their views taken into account on kind of small scale routing issues and whatnot makes the whole process go a lot easier. Through following kind of that consultation process, you'll head into delivery mode, really, where you kind of try to pull together all the main documents that are required to enable you to get a submission together for an examination process, which is led by the planning inspectorate. Those documents are wide ranging, but everything from the CPO documents, so books of reference, land plans, and statutory documents like those, statements of reasons, but probably of more interest to most people will be things like the environmental impact assessments, construction methodologies. There'll be all sorts of documents that the different delivery and disciplines all have to pull together, and probably most notably the actual piece of legislation that you're pulling together to deliver the project. You get to draft that, so the legal team will be busy pulling all that together. That's the project's busy at that point, pulling everything in. We'll submit an application. There's a pre-examination period. This is where affected parties then get to kind of submit any relevant reps, and you head into examination, which is approximately a kind of a 6-month process. It's predominantly a written process with questions from the examiner back to the project, and there'll be set hearings and on certain topics, from engineering and environmental topics through to compulsory purchase acquisition hearings. They'll conclude, and then PINs, planning, etc. It takes 3 months to issue a recommendation, and then the Secretary of State should then have another 3 months to make a decision. Those dates are kind of defined within the Act, but not always adhered to. But broadly speaking, as I was saying earlier, that what's quite appealing to developers is that process is quite defined, and you can kind of on day one probably write a program and understand when you'll get your consent and your decisions way ahead of time, because there is no planning inquiries, there's no going back and revisiting things if you get all your documents right and everything submitted correctly. So that's the kind of DCO process. the process was kind of first introduced in around 2008 with the Planning Act. I started working on these projects in kind of 2011, 2012 when some of the first pipeline schemes came forward, and not much has changed in the way they were delivered, but other than they kind of continually become slightly more gold plated with each project that comes to try and de-risk the delivery of it. That's good in some ways, but in other ways it means they were kind of starting to slow down the delivery, and they were becoming quite challenging to get over the line. And I think the government recognised this, and along with probably plenty of political reasons, quite keen to get things moving with major infrastructure in the country. So a big part of Labour when they came in's kind of direction of travel was speeding up nationally significant infrastructure projects. So in March 24, the government brought forward some potential reforms to make it those things that I've listed there, but it was very, kind of up in the air. This was like towards the end of the kind of Conservative time, and it was just, there wasn't much meat on it. Followed by Feb 25, so earlier this year, some things started to actually come out how things were going to change, with some advice notes. PIN's released quite a helpful one actually, which was actually defining from a lands perspective how linear projects, particularly like where there was areas of disagreement, and getting compulsory acquisition hearings sometimes were starting to become quite challenging on projects, and this was a way of uniform across projects, making sure that areas of disagreement were kind of categorized in a similar way, and books of reference and compulsory acquisition schedules and those sorts of documents all talk to each other. So that was quite a good piece of advice. In April 25, a much more wide-ranging consultation was kind of launched, and it set out some of its goals, and some of these were actually then becoming a little bit more radical, with an overall goal of it wanted to take about a year out of the process. When I say a year out of the process, on average, it was probably taking a couple of years for a project to get to the point where it could get to examination from inception, and they want to try and speed that up. I mentioned already that statutory consultation was being removed. I think there'll still be some form of consultation that will be required, but that was kind of quite a big piece that projects going forward now are going to have to consider if they can save time by doing that. There's some removing of quite old notice procedural information, so removing what they're required to put things in certain magazines and things, which doesn't really make much difference. There's quite a bit more responsibility planned to be put on statutory consultees such as Natural England and local authorities, because they can often hold up the process. So they're making sure that they understand their responsibilities, but also coming with that is, I think, some more funding from the projects towards those organisations to make sure that funding's not the issue. And more excitingly, to a lands part of the lands team, is the CPO process probably becoming slightly more flexible, so that if individuals weren't identified or have come forward or changed midway through the examination, it should be possible to add them into an existing CPO process and not have to essentially start again, which caused significant delays. One of the main delays throughout the whole process has always been also during the consultation phase. If you make a significant change, having to rerun an entire consultation, and again, that requirement is being removed. They're going to redesign the fast track and pre-app services. I'll let Tom probably talk in a minute about Biodiversity Net Gain, but that was planned to come in November this year, and that's now been delayed to 2026. So again, it's challenging times for those working on major projects at the moment, because a lot of the rules that we were expecting to come into play haven't, or have been delayed, and then a new consultation with some potentially exciting things has come in but not yet finalised. Quick case study. I don't know how much time I've got. Rach, a couple of minutes?
Yeah, a couple of minutes.
So I had the pleasure of working today on Cadence HyNet Northwest Hydrogen Pipeline Scheme. Quite a big scheme, this one, and it was kind of one of the forerunners of hydrogen pipelines. HyNet's obviously a slightly bigger scheme than just the hydrogen delivery. It also includes carbon capture and hydrogen production and storage. But this was the kind of the cadence part of the project, the creation of the hydrogen gas pipelines of various different diameters, 10, 12 hydrogen above ground installations. At one end, there will then be a further development of storage and kind of salt caverns. Whilst it didn't really, it wasn't captured within the definition of a nationally significant infrastructure project, it elected to become one and was accepted, I think, under Section 35 of the Planning Act. So it's been treated as a DCO since. We've completed all the land referencing on this, which basically involves also early stage engagement with all the landowners and people impacted. Numerous boreholes along the scheme to help the engineering and feed designs have been taken place on all of the legs, and broadly on the left hand side of the cross there's that's where the production will be, goes into a multi site in the middle, where down to the south it can go into the storage facility and the salt caverns. A leg goes off up to kind of Partington and Manchester, and a leg goes off up to St Helens, and essentially all the way along the routes teeing into the users of the hydrogen, high energy industrial users. So yeah, quite a novel scheme when it first came out, and there's a few others that are now following along. We've worked really closely with the engineers, the environment teams, the planning, the comms, as a kind of a group to get this delivered. We've done lots of surveys, obviously. There's this one we did a non-stat and 2 statutory consultations, so kind of coming back to that reform point of, if we were acting under the new legislation, we probably wouldn't have needed to do another or either of those statutory consultations, so it would have happened quicker. And we obviously get heavily involved with every one of those landowners impacted, with meeting, discussing, checking, routing, minutiae, and making sure it all makes sense. And we're currently preparing for submission for that scheme, so that's been quite an exciting project to be involved with.
Thanks, Mark.
Probably me out of time, I think.
Yes, it is. I'm going to keep going and then we'll do questions at the end. Sarah, are you happy to take over?
Yeah, lovely. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Sarah Renzy Thomson, Chartered Planner and also partner at Fisher German. So moving on from what Mark has taken us through, so that's kind of like the highest level of planning consenting, the DCO process. So kind of taking a step down is the Town and Country Planning Act consenting hierarchy. And that's one that the team that I work with specialise in. So we specialise in delivering consents for infrastructure projects that are not quite as big as Mark, but still some decent sized projects. We operate in a range of sectors: water, waste, fibre, electricity, gas, oil, renewable energy. So I'm going to start off with just a short case study about a linear pipeline that we've been working on, and then just finish off with some topical planning updates to give you some tidbits to talk to your colleagues about. Okay, so the case study. So this is a waste pipeline that we're currently working on. That's currently going from 2 or 3 sites into a watercourse, but for very good reasons, it needs to be moved from discharging into those watercourses to discharging into an alternative watercourse. And those reasons are very good. They're driven by the Environment Agency and Natural England. The current discharges are going to a watercourse where they're really trying to remove any artificial sources of water going into them for reasons of ecology protection. So it's a SSSI and an SAC, and also flow. The flows that are going in are getting too large and they're changing the shape of the watercourse, and it's just too much of a volume and it's exceeding their limits. So those are the project drivers. The length of the pipeline is 23.5 kilometres, so still a decent length. And you can see from the plan there's a couple of sources going into it, and then it goes across the screen to the watercourse on the left-hand side. So as I mentioned, it's below the DCO threshold. So that means we're consenting at a local level through the Town and Country Planning Act. This pipeline is for a statutory undertaker, and as a statutory undertaker, they are performing duties as part of their undertaking which benefit from substantial permitted development rights. But those permitted development rights can only be used if the scheme can be screened out from an environmental impact assessment perspective. So this project's starting point is to EIA screen the project, ideally for the operator, screen it out. So then that gives the project a much shorter timescale, because you don't need to go through the town and country planning application process, but you can do it through your own permitted development rights. You still have to comply with all the other laws, for example, protected species and other constraints, but in terms of town planning, this is the process that we go through. And the first step is to look at all of those constraints along the route and work with the design team to make sure the route is the optimum and minimising the impact as far as possible. On this particular route, the constraints included protected trees, so trees with tree protection orders, ecology, it's quite a rural area, archaeology, and there were also multiple road and watercourse crossings. So with this kind of scheme, the key impact is during construction. Once the pipeline's in place, this route is entirely below ground. Once it's in place, the impacts are on the watercourse rather than across the pipeline route. So to start with, this is looking at the engagement and the consenting side of things. So this particular pipeline, with it being 23 kilometres, it crossed two county councils. So you're dealing straight off, you're dealing with two sets of planning officers from different authorities, and they will have their own processes for consultation, although sometimes they work together, but in this case they did issue separate consents, EI screening opinions. So we met with both authorities and officers within there to explain the scheme, because it's not often schemes of this scale and nature come across local planning officers' desks. So it's really important that you bring it to life, you show them what it's all about, explain the key drivers, because when you submit your screening report, there's such a lot of detail for them to get into that it really, really helps to engage at that early point. And again, like I said, the importance of the screening process is that if you are able to screen a project out from requiring an impact assessment, then you can use your permitted development rights going forward to install that particular route. So in this case, both councils did screen out the need for EIA. It was based on a screening request that we submitted with various mitigation measures within it to demonstrate how we were going to manage the project, how Severn Trent were going to implement it, and how they're going to make sure that the impacts were really minimised. So once we had that screening opinion, the pipeline itself was permitted development. So it was not an EIA scheme and no planning application was required. However, that's for the elements that were included as permitted development, but there were also additions that were required that did trigger the need for planning permission. So this is a really important element of a scheme. So whilst the construction phase is quite extensive, there will need to be numerous access points to be able to install a pipeline of this nature. And this scheme in particular required 15 temporary vehicle access points. So even though we screened out the pipeline installation itself, because these new access points are needed off classified roads, separate planning applications are required for all of those access points. Also, in addition, planning applications are required for new buildings within the treatment works. So although we screened out the majority, it's also important to remember that there are small elements within a scheme of this nature that still need planning consent. So that's what's currently working on that project. That's just to give you a bit of a feel of the EIA process. In terms of timescales, once you've prepared your screening application and submit it to the council, the deadlines are between 21 and 90 days. Often that goes over. It can be mutually agreed to extend that deadline. This one did go slightly over, but we've just recently had one on another project which they stuck to the 3 weeks, and that was due to the extensive engagement that we did prior to submitting the screening application. Next slide, Rach. Okay, so I just thought I'd finish off with some topical planning news. So unless anything has changed today, which it could do, there's so much going on with the government at the minute. So the planning minister remains Matthew Pennycock. He's still in place following the recent reshuffle. The government are preparing lots of changes to the planning system. They're trying to roll out a new, faster local plan system. So every local planning authority area has a local plan. On average, it's been taking 7 years to get those from start to finish, and the government want to reduce that to 2.5. So again, similar to what Mark was saying, they're going to be removing certain parts of the consultation. They're going to make things much tighter and ultimately much quicker. There's also proposed reforms to statutory consultee systems, potentially removing some. So the list of statutory consultees, and those are the bodies that once a planning application is submitted, they have to review it and comment on it. It's quite an old list. For example, there's a theatre trust on there. There's all sorts of consultees that are probably a little bit out of date now. So that's currently under review. And also the government are seeing if they can charge applicants for that consultee process, which would be an additional fee. I think Tom is going to pick this up shortly, but there's also been consultation on Biodiversity Net Gain for NSIP projects and also Town and Country Planning Act projects, with a view to make it more practical and proportionate for small scale development. So as Tom's going to come into, this is a really big part of the Town and Country planning permission applications at the moment. The vast majority are requiring Biodiversity Net Gain, which is a 10% gain on projects, and this can be quite a challenge for smaller scale development, so there is a reviewing process to see what can be done about that. Also, there's proposed reform to streamline the planning appeal process, and this particularly is in relation to written reps with a view to speeding that up, and there's going to be more information on that coming out in the autumn 2025. There's been some new standards issued for sustainable urban drainage systems. The aim of this is to reduce the volume of water runoff and also improving water quality and biodiversity. So there's some new guidance on that. And then recently there was a government consultation specifically for the electricity sector. This closed at the beginning of September, but interestingly, it proposed increasing the permitted threshold for substations from 29 cubic metres to 45 cubic metres, which could be quite a substantial benefit to electricity operators. And it's also very interesting that the 29 cubic metres also carries across into other PD rights. It's also in the water, the waste and the gas. So this could lead to a slightly different and increased permitted threshold for other sectors as well. So I thought it was useful to just mention that. Thanks,
Great.
Rach.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really good. I'm going to keep things moving. Tom, are you good to go?
Yeah, once I found the unmute button. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me along. My name is Tom Beeley. I'm the Natural Capital Advisor within Fisher German. I'm a surveyor, but I've ended up looking at quite detailed natural capital, a lot of it with landowners, looking at the supply of habitat and biodiversity units, but also working pretty closely with Sarah and the planning team on this, because ultimately BNG is a planning policy. So getting quite heavily involved in lots of BNG projects, both private, across lots of different projects really. So just to provide a bit of background and policy context for BNG, I'm hoping that most people have now come across BNG to some extent. There seems to have been a lot of chat over it over the past 2 years really, and it's not going away. It's something that every time you look at it, there's a new angle on it and a new complexity. So I thought it'd be useful just to start with a bit of policy context as to why we have BNG. Basically, the UK is now regarded as one of the most heavily declined, has heavy decline in biodiversity, as recognised by the State of Nature Report 2024. So BNG is one policy response which aims to try and reverse this decline in biodiversity that we're seeing in the UK. It was introduced through the Environment Act in 2021, so that's the legislation which underpins Biodiversity Net Gain, but it was actually introduced to the planning system as of February 2024, so it's been around for just over 18 months now, applying to planning applications really. Very simply, the overall objective of Biodiversity Net Gain is to ensure that all development leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than before the development took place. That's the very simple aim of it. So it's trying to go from a system where the planning system largely required historically has required to sort of minimise the impact of biodiversity, minimise the impact on biodiversity as much as possible. We're now going to a system where actually you're actively required to increase biodiversity as a result of development. So what we're finding is although it's a planning policy, there's huge amount of impact from BNG. It's relevant to planners, developers, land managers, both corporate and private, land rights team, valuers. It's going to impact across all these different specialisms, so it's quite involved and quite complex to try and get your head around things. There are really two sides to biodiversity net gain. There's biodiversity net gain in the development planning side, which I see as the sort of the demand side. Actually, anyone putting in a planning application is probably going to need to deal with biodiversity net gain, and may well need to buy habitat units to fulfill their planning requirements. The other side of the things, which is mostly where I tend to get involved, is on the sort of the supply side, looking at habitat bank development, looking at actually how you deliver habitat either on site or off site, and I think that's probably where I have the input most with Sarah and her planning team, is discussing actually how you go about achieving biodiversity net gain through the planning process. So next slide, please. This has already said it, it's a planning requirement since February 2024. It is mandatory in England, so it doesn't apply in Wales or Scotland. They are looking at BNG in Wales and Scotland, but it's likely to be slightly different. So it's a planning policy, so it's part of the planning application process. Developers must deliver a BNG uplift, a minimum uplift of 10% through the development planning process. I think there are a few local authorities that are looking to go beyond that minimum 10%. I've heard today that Buckinghamshire is looking at a slightly strange policy of where you're requiring offsetting outside of their area. You might need to deliver sort of 20%, for example. But there is it'll be interesting to see how those policies are reviewed over time, because I don't think central government are particularly keen on people going and on local authorities going beyond that minimum 10% at the moment, but some of them are. It does apply to most forms of development which require a planning application. There are some very few limited exceptions. Currently, NSIP projects are outside of the scope of biodiversity net gain. As Mark suggested earlier, that is likely to change from May 2026. We're expecting biodiversity net gain to be introduced for NSIP projects from May 2026. So there has been a consultation out there setting out some of the details of how that will work, but we're awaiting the final legislation and guidance on exactly how that will be implemented, so space to watch and keep an eye on. The other major exemption at the moment is for projects that permitted development. If you're not required to submit a full planning application, then you're generally outside of the scope of BNG, so that's another quite useful exemption. There are also some de minimis requirements, so anything less than 25 meters squared, impacting less than 25 meters squared of habitat, essentially, you can sort of falls out of scope of biodiversity net gain as well. And the consultation that Sarah referenced is looking at expanding some of the exemptions and exemptions and things that are available to limit the impact on small scale development, which is potentially quite useful. So that consultation is now closed, and we're just sort of waiting the response from government on that. Quite when that will be, who knows, but hopefully sort of towards the end of this year or early next year, I think would be welcome to get some clarity on that. Just in terms of the process for biodiversity net gain, it really is the sort of start point. Actually, biodiversity assessment should be pretty early in the process now. So undertaking a baseline habitat assessment to determine what the habitat value of your development site is going to be. That sets your baseline for planning purposes, determines actually how many units you're going to have to the 10% target you're going to have to achieve. You don't need to submit that information in your application. As a sort of a minimum, you need to have been able to set out what your habitat baseline is as part of your planning application, and as I say, you really need that to get that at the outset, so that you know that what your habitat what the habitat target is, and make sure that actually if you need to undertake works and things like that, you're not damaging the site and reducing the baseline, which is as it can be sort of catching out in the planning. And submit submit the planning application and wait for your consent, assuming consent is given. Once consent is received, you then got a further step in the planning process, which is to submit a biodiversity net gain plan, which sets out how you're going to go about achieving your biodiversity net gain, and that's a sort of maximum of 8-week process to actually discharge that condition. So it's a pre-commencement condition that BNG applies as a pre-commencement condition on every planning decision notice. Sometimes it can be missed because it's usually put as an informative rather than a specific condition in the list of conditions, but it is something that needs to be discharged before work can start on site. And as I say, to get that condition discharged, you need to submit your net gain plan, which needs to be reviewed and approved by the local authority. So there is an extension to the planning process essentially. That 8-week discharge is a maximum. In reality, I think they're probably happening a bit quicker than that. Sarah will probably know better than me on that, but just be aware of that. There is an extension to the planning process really. It's important to note that you can't submit that net gain plan until the day after you've received your consent, so you can't sort of submit it early and get a discharge early. What you can do, of course, is throughout the process is actually be working up how you go about discharging that consent, because it may be that whether you're going to deliver biodiversity on site or actually you're going to go and acquire units off site, either from a habitat bank developer or from a third-party landowner, so that you can prepare that information, discuss it with the local authority, and almost sort of and get your net gain plan ready to submit ASAP really once you've got your consent. So how do you go about achieving a net gain? Well, there are really a sort of few options. There's a mitigation hierarchy that you need to have regard to. That sets out in legislation that you need to sort of go through this hierarchy, prioritising avoidance of habitat loss over compensation. So the legislation, as I say, sets out this hierarchy that in site selection and designing your site, you've got to try and avoid habitat loss within the site. Once you've done that, you then look at actually what can you achieve on site, either through enhancement of the habitat that might be there already, or creation of habitat, of new habitat on site, which may be possible. Clearly, there's going to be limitations to what can be done there, particularly with infrastructure projects. It may be possible that you can deliver some on-site enhancement and creation to contribute to your 10% net gain. But what we're seeing is actually, in reality, there's a mix of both on-site and off-site. So where you can't deliver things off-site, on-site, you then need to go and acquire off-site habitat unit, typically from the private market, which is out there now. So you need to have a look and acquire units to achieve your 10% net gain. We've helped a few clients now go out and acquire those units from a variety of different sources. There's quite a few sort of rules around how you achieve your net gain, known as the trading rules, which need to be met. So you need to offset your habitat loss with on a like for like or like for better basis. So if you're losing one type of habitat, you've got to go out and replace it like for like or like for better really. So you go through that process of acquiring units. If you can't find those off-site units in the private market, and it is quite a well-established private market now, the final option is you can go and acquire statutory credits from the government essentially. These are fairly high cost. They're very much an option of last resort. They're priced to be an option of last resort. So they start at a minimum of £42,000 per unit. And the important aspect to remember is that you need 2 credits for every unit that you need. So in reality, the minimum price is £84,000 per unit. So pretty high cost to go out and achieve those. As I say, we've gone out and acquired units for clients. We've got a good case study now where one client was needed some fairly high distinctiveness habitat units which weren't available weren't sort of readily available. There was very limited supply of them in the country. They were looking at a statutory credit cost of around about £154,000 for going out and acquiring the credit. Small scale site expansion to go out and find some units on the market and save them around sort of 50,000 and keep the project moving on a fairly scale. I think that one is now fully resolved and through the planning process. I've got a sort of positive story on that one, but that's essentially the different steps, the different options you've got for achieving your net gain. Just on to the next slide, please. Just a very brief market update. It is the biodiversity net gain in offsite provision market is now growing. It's taken a while to establish. Early on in the introduction of biodiversity net gain, there was a real lack of supply of offsite units. So anyone going through development trying to discharge their planning consent, the BNG condition on their planning consent, was finding it quite challenging to find the units. That is now changing. There's 105 habitats, probably more now actually. There seems to be about 15 a month going up on the register. There's about 105 habitat banks. I think they cover about 5,000 hectares in total. Oh no, sorry, 3,575 hectares in total across the country. There's quite a few local authorities and national character areas now covered. So lots of projects will be able to go out and acquire units directly from these habitat banks of oven-ready units available to discharge planning conditions. Say not all your national character areas and local planning authority areas are covered yet, but there's certainly a much greater supply than there has been. So anyone looking to acquire units, there's now a pretty good supply out there. There's also lots of different sites at sort of various stages of the habitat bank development process. So in development, they might not yet be on the register. They might be quite close to it. But as I say, you can go out and acquire most types of units now that you can. Some of them, there is still a shortage of supply in some types of habitat unit. So watercourse units still not particularly well supplied, and they are very high cost. But other types, lots of neutral grassland, we're starting to see the price come down from that just because the volume of supply that there is. So yeah, say there's a changing market there, and the number of allocations from habitat banks is increasing. I think there's probably been a bit of a shift in mindset amongst developers as well, where originally lots of people tried to deliver things on site, comply with the mitigation hierarchy and say sort of incorporate habitat within the development sites. There's a bit of a mindset shift and recognition of the appeal of the offset market, where you can sort of cover all of the sort of the upfront cost of delivering habitat for the 30-year requirement, and can relatively easily discharge your planning condition. So yeah, that's just worth being aware of. Next slide, if there is one. I think that's probably it. Yeah, it's a very brief whistle-stop tour of BNG. I seem to endlessly talk about it. I'm sure anybody that's had anything to do with BNG will find that will know that it's a subject that can create lots of chat and questions. We could probably have spent a day and a half just talking about BNG. So very quick whistle-stop tour of it. Happy to take any questions on it there.
Thank you, Tom. Well, thank you, all of you. I think all of them could have been, all the topics could have been webinars in their own right. So you've done really well to keep to time exceptionally well. We have had a question in aimed, so DCO theme, but it's the future and it's regarding BNG. So Tom, I'm going to direct it towards you. If a DCO crosses multiple national character areas post May 26, when BNG forms part of the DCO regime, would a BNG plan be required for each national character area that the DCO is going to affect? I know you're crystal ball gazing, but what are your thoughts?
No, I don't think you'll need you'll essentially, as my understanding of it is, you'll need a sort of baseline for the project, and I think you're going to be able to deliver the offset in sort of large blocks. There's nothing to stop you offsetting outside a national character area. The way that BNG works and the sort of metric that calculates all habitat values is they apply a multiplier. So you can offset outside your national character area, but there's a sort of, you're incentivized not to, or penalized if you do. but my understanding is that you'll be able to sort of offset in large blocks from in one area of the national character, in one national character area. You will be able to deliver the offsetting for other areas of within the pipeline, as I understand it, but it's yet to be finalised and clarified. So it is a bit of crystal ball gazing, really.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. I think what would be a good point to cover is we've got a lot of schemes moving forward. I mean, you've all talked about examples that come from different places, different industries, whether it's Mark, you gave a hydrogen example, Sarah, you were talking about a wastewater scheme, and Tom, you've talked about creating habitats as well as offsetting as well. The land use requirements in the UK are the demand is ever increasing, and there's more work. We all know there's more work to do on the infrastructure side, probably ahead of us than there ever has been before. So question to all of you, but you can give different answers, but how will you work with other operators and other projects that are coming forward? How will you factor that into your design for the project you're working on, and what can be done to increase the collaboration between utility companies, infrastructure operators, energy providers, to try and make that process as streamlined as possible? Mark, do you want to go first?
I definitely sympathise with the question and the problem. The solutions probably a few less so, other than the usual. It'd be nice if everyone could communicate a bit more openly. A couple of examples, I guess, to start with, of, I won't name the scheme, but we've been working on a scheme in the east of England where 2 or 3 years ago it was farmland, and now it looks like we're routing through a large solar farm for miles and miles and miles, and it's not one solar farm. There's like 10 or 5 or 10 different solar farms now that have just appeared. And one of the challenges is we all know how difficult it is across all the different schemes we work on to discuss grid connections and the certainty of them, and so the viability of these schemes is actually unknown, and communicating with those schemes is a challenge. So I can sympathise with the challenge in that example. I can also sympathise particularly in the hydrogen world, where we've got a number of projects that are all basically competing for similar funding streams, so increasing communication between those projects is almost it's difficult to know whether it's competitive or anti-competitive. It's a real challenge. So yeah, I can see the challenges. I know that obviously there are things like NISO and whatever, where the government's trying to put in kind of higher level strategies to basically say this is what we want where, and now get on and deliver it. But that sounds nice and straightforward and simple, but then you put it back out into the privatized delivery models and it becomes more challenging. So sorry, no real solutions other than talking to each other, making sure that we all are at least aware of each other's projects, and kind of keeping those communication channels as open as they can between projects. And half the time there will be mutually suitable, you can route through. I'm talking in a pipeline context, there's often a route through, things can be designed in a way to deal with it, and you can deal with cathodic protection issues and whatever it might be, the interface between these projects, it's all can be engineered out, but comms are needed.
I think
I was just going to say it's definitely shall I go? Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting point, Rachel, because increasingly when we're looking at initial pipeline routes, the list of constraints is getting longer, and part of that is the development land constraints. As we mentioned, local plans, the councils are under pressure to get those through. They've got big housing targets to meet, other things to provide, so land is under pressure. At the same time, there's already infrastructure in the ground that needs to be crossed, so there's all sorts of crossing consents that need to be in place. So and biodiversity net gain is another layer that's going to be on land, that's not always going to be visible when you're doing these routing, initial routing for pipelines. So that's another constraint to consider as part of any kind of development project going forward. So there's all sorts of layers, and it's becoming increasingly complex to find a route through that minimises impacts.
Yeah, I think just to add on what Sarah said about BNG. I think the development side and the sort of planning side of BNG is one side of it, but then it's going to get increasingly complex for the land rights. Actually, there's if your pipeline or pylon route happens to go through a BNG, a site that's been allocated for BNG and units sold from it, then it's going to create a bit of a headache potentially. I think one of the challenges is, whilst there is a net gain register, a central net gain register where all of the BNG sites are allocated, there isn't currently, as far as I'm aware, a publicly available sort of GIS layer that maps out all of these habitat sites that is sort of easily accessible. They are registered, and again, against the title, but as local land charges, which again aren't all that visible as far as I'm aware. So I think there is an exercise due to potentially try and digitise some of that information on local land charges, but that's going to take a long time to materialise. So as Sarah had said, there's sort of a lack of transparency around where these BNG habitat bank sites are for things like route planning, and then actually even when they do, it's actually making sure that the wording of the legal agreements, which are sort of binding them for 30 years, make provisions for statutory undertakers to get the access they need and give them the sufficient protections and things that they do need. So I think that is something that government probably need to look at, is, say, providing that digital GIS layer of where all these sites are. And I mean, those are the sort of officially registered sites. There's then all the sites that are potentially in development and under option agreement as well, which are a whole different kettle of fish, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complex and challenging time, and I think great point, Mark, about communication. Essentially, it's about really getting to know, if you're on a linear scheme, it's understanding what all those landowners are intending to do with their land. It might not necessarily be a habitat bank now, but they might be planning for it to be in the future and in the process of signing it up. So it's kind of full circle back to your point, Mark, about communication, whether that's with other operators or the landowners whose land you'll be affecting, because what's planned and what's there might be in two different phases, and that's where sort of Sarah's team come in from a planning perspective. That's been really, really useful and interesting, and I know you're all available and your contact details are available via the Guild if people have further questions. I just wanted to just take a last couple of minutes just to mention the Big 25 challenge that you've all been involved with, which is a Pan-Fisher German event essentially aimed at transporting a baton between all of our offices, and we're doing all for charity. So Mark, I think you did quite a few miles on the bike yesterday, and we're really delighted that you could join us today. Good job it wasn't a standing event.
Yes, I'm enjoying sitting down for the presentation, but yeah, 35 miles of cross-country mountain biking through the Cotswolds yesterday. Beautiful view, but yeah, tiring on the legs. But yeah, and I'm sure if everyone's up for Googling it, it'll all be available somewhere. But there's some amazing causes that all the different offices are. We've all nominated local charities, and we've all got our own little targets to raise money. And please, if you do get 5 minutes, or anyone in your organisation does, feel free to have a look and donate a few pennies. It'd be amazing.
Yeah, it very much is aimed at sort of social value and giving back to the communities that we work in. So we're across the whole of the country, and so the charities are chosen by each geographical location. So it's 25 charities, 25 offices, and all modes of transport except with a vehicle and an engine are permitted to get the baton from one office to the next. And if you want to join us on one of those legs, then please do get in touch and we can get you involved. But yeah, this webinar will be available via the Guild's YouTube channel. Please check out the Guild website for further events and webinars. And I'm going to close us out at that. But thank you so much to our guest speakers. Very much appreciated.
Thanks, Reg.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later.
Bye.